China's global presence and influence has been growing rapidly in recent years.
We have withdrawn the United States from the horrendous Paris Climate Accord, something that would have put our country back decades and decades.
With the US retreat from international mechanisms such as the TPP and the Paris Climate Agreement, how will China demonstrate responsible leadership in international affairs? Besides international affairs, China is also facing tremendous challenges such as political reform, economic restructuring, wealth disparity and environmental pollution. How should China balance its domestic policy and international engagement? As the world's second-largest economy, China has been a main driving force for global economic growth, especially during the recent recession. Some are asking China to take even more responsibility. What's China's answer? Joseph Nye said a nation's strength is also determined by the quality of its soft power. How strong is China's soft power in the international arena?
Following the United States' withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Climate Agreement, China, as the second-largest economy, is expected to take more international responsibility. Facing rising anti-globalization and protectionism, how will China be able to help lead global renewal with its proposals, such as the Belt and Road Initiative and Asian Infrastructure Development Bank? At the same time, some have said that China should pay more attention to domestic problems, such as political reform, wealth distribution, and increased pollution, rather than trying to be the world savior. To discuss how China can provide benefit to the world while at the same time dealing with its own domestic problems, I'm pleased to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Fabio Massimo Parenti from the Italian International Institute. We shall also talk to Robert Koepp, Director of the Economist Corporate Network, via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be
here. A senior professor from the Central Party School, a think tank of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, said recently in an article of Financial Times that China should not think of itself as the savior of the world. Instead, we should focus more on the domestic reconstruction of our economy and even institutions to get prepared for being the second best, in the words of some of those observers who say, hey, come on, China is not ready yet. What do you think of these debates?
I think that there is no contradiction between domestic policies and international policies, in the sense that they are dialectically related. Domestic policies, to be successful, require that each country has a clear idea about its international role, and vice versa. So as, for example, Pietro Nenni is an old socialist leader in Italy. In 60s and 70s, he always emphasized the importance for Italy and for social development to establish a good international relations through European integration policies and also through China's greater role in international community. So Pietro Nenni was a supporter of the entrance of People's Republic of China within the Security Council of United Nations. So it is always, I think it's not a contradiction, both things goes hand in hand.
Can I have your assessment about what is called the domestic challenges in China at this moment?
Yes. The main problems are well known, at least in Western media. We always used to prevalently blame China for the level of corruption, for the problem of pollution in mega cities and the constant process of urbanization that is very rapid, is creating a lot of problems, and also many other environmental issues are debated or used just to criticize China. But overall, as I said at the beginning, these problems are our problems. We only in Italy have a lot of this problem, not talking about Mexico.
Exactly, many developed countries
exactly.
Went through much the same challenges during their a period of development transformation. Let me go to Robert Koepp for his comments on domestic priorities that the ruling party, the CPC, faces at this moment. Hello, Robert.
Hi, Yang Ray.
Hi, Robert. We're discussing whether China should think of itself as a savior of the world. Maybe we have exaggerated the issue a little bit, but this is what we quote from a senior professor of the Central Party School. China is not ready yet to assume more international responsibility because we have so much domestic woes to handle. I'd like to have your take.
Well, there is a point to that, right? That if you get too concerned about your international relations and you fail at delivering domestic priorities, that becomes an imbalance. The U.S. indeed itself has suffered from that. That goes back particularly to the 1960s during the Johnson administration when he was trying to create a great society, but then involved the U.S. in the war in Indochina, and neither worked out well. So I could go on and on about that as a comparison, but I think relevant to China, there is obviously a lot of ways it could continue to improve domestically. At the same time, it's very careful to avoid another analogy from American history, and that's the 1930s isolationism. If China were to take the attitude that, well, the rest of the world's problems don't matter, China is now the world's second largest economy, even if it still has poverty and other issues at home. It is the major global trading power. And there are a lot of countries, in fact, almost all countries that trade with China have a trade deficit. So it's really important that China try to balance that out and look at its role in the world to help balance out trade and bring about fair and more open trade.
Robert, here is a question that has kept so many Chinese observers puzzled for a long while. We have been leapfrogging for years in what is called the post-developmental pattern. That's something that we have been following since 30 years ago. Now, do you think it's an issue of a philosophical attitude towards whether we should go international, or it's more about how to prioritize the issues on the agenda of this generation of the Chinese leadership?
Well, I guess it's a mixture of both. China can't avoid international engagement. It's a matter of how it wants to conduct international engagement. To give an example of how it could maybe do a bit of both, take care of domestic issues as well as international issues, agricultural development is something China has done very well in, yet it could still do more. Where it has done well in particularly poor parts of the country, it can take that expertise, like Ningxia, Qinghai area, a lot of the Northeast. It could take that into areas around, say, the Middle East, which has a lot of hot spots, or Latin America. I would even say the United States could probably benefit in some ways from agrarian economic policies that are more environmentally balanced that China has been experimenting with. I mean, America has a much more advanced agribusiness sector, but it doesn't always have the best agricultural techniques. So China has not only recent experience, but a millennia of experience, actually, that could be applied here. At the same time, China, again, needs to look at where it is in the global economy currently and how it can use its massive markets to help other countries develop by importing more of their goods. So I think it can do a bit of both. It can use examples of how it's improving for other countries to learn from. It can also help improve its own economy further by opening up access to goods and services from abroad to help its domestic constituents benefit from the gains of trade.
The issue is whether China's global policies are shaped by elites or through policy hearings that involve a lot of the general public. Now, here is one allegation from our American friend, Robert and Fabio. The Americans argue, for the past 3 decades, China has been able to benefit from this open international economic order, and that has been placed under the security umbrella of the United States. Since our entry into the WTO back in the year 2001, we have benefited enormously from free trade and investment. Now it's time, they argue, that China or the world should be rewarded by China's or more of China's contributions and international responsibilities. What do you think of this argument, Fabio?
China surely has to be even more responsible, as is already demonstrating in international diplomacy, international institutions, in order to played a role that already is recognized by many countries around the world. So I don't think that US supported and helped really China's development during the last decades, because as far as I study war and media topics and case studies in Middle East and North Africa, not to mention Afghanistan, it is quite clear that US-driven coalitions are destabilizing many strategic areas that reduce opportunities for free trade and global trade.
Look, China has developed a very close economic interconnectivity with the United States, which is our largest economy to a large degree, and therefore we've been able to collect the biggest forex reserve over the past 2 decades in particular. And therefore the United States says, look, we have to renegotiate the terms of a BIT, bilateral investment treaty, so that we'll open the door wider for American investment capitals and services. What do you think of their grievances in the context that America should be prioritized during the era of the Trump administration?
Again, both countries, big powers, have to open up their economy equally. So one request...
Are you suggesting that the United States should open its door wide open for exporting high-tech products? In this area, the United States has been pretty cautious with the Cold War mentality, citing national security as the reason.
Exactly.
Is that another form of a trade protectionism?
When we talk about subsidies to certain strategic sectors, when we talk to some trade barriers that before Trump were in place in European Union, in agricultural products we were talking about, for example, very widely subsidized in Europe and in United States, the Bill Farm. So not to talk about military technology and production. The debate around general words and concepts are very misleading because they are ideological. When we look at data, we can clearly see that where the United States is still competitive, it is in surplus with China. When we look at service categories in bilateral trade, US is in surpluses constantly with China. But the United States has no more a wide industrial basis compared to
But the problem
China.
is, part of the problem, Fabio and Robert, is that we haven't opened our capital account. RMB cannot be converted freely. Although we've been listed as one of the major reserve currencies in the basket of the IMF or special drawing rights. Robert, what do you think of the American complaints that we should open our door open, and in return China says in our counter-argument, you have to export more of the high-tech products?
Well, I think there's a matter of security concern there. I guess you could, if you want to call it protectionism, but the U.S. would argue it's not at all a protectionist move, it's a security-related move. And until there's some cybersecurity, a commonality of understanding between the U.S. and China, I wouldn't hold my breath on the U.S. exporting defense-related technology to China. Moreover, I would argue that although indeed there's something of a service surplus between the U.S. and China, China actively protects against the internet. So the leading economy, the leading companies of the new U.S. economy, Google, Facebook, Twitter, these sorts of organizations cannot get into China. Now China claims
you know
that
what,
sovereignty,
Robert, you know what, because the Chinese government says, look, we have to take the issue of cyber national sovereignty very seriously. You cannot say,
sure,
we must guarantee 100% free flow of information without carrying the national security one way or another. Because in the age of big data and cloud computing, you know what happens, right?
Sure. No, look, we could look at this issue in more detail. It's certainly a complex issue. But, you know, and it's interesting, too, how on that notion of security, the U.S. can claim it won't export. China will claim it can't import. So, you know, until, put it this way, until there is a commonality of understanding between both sides, it's not going to change. But that leaves a big gap. So there is the trade gap there. Perhaps if China is looking for more balanced trade, it could focus on other countries, because there are other countries that aren't trying to export, say, internet services and products, but are trying to export products, finished goods that China could use and would benefit from if it were more open. Your point about the capital account as well, definitely that would help ease a lot of the investment flows and trade flows if China had an open capital account.
Thank you so much, Robert and Fabio, for your participation in this discussion. When we come back, I'll ask you questions such as why Robert Zoellick, a former senior government official of the United States, says China should become a major international responsible stakeholder, and what it implies for further integration of China into the rest of the world. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back, gentlemen. Let's look at Europe. During the financial crisis in Europe, China's investment was called the savior of the European economy. Ironically, I don't think so. China bought a lot of European treasury bonds. And in fact, the European Central Bank has also bought some of the RMB and taken that as a part of their forex reserve. It's mutually beneficial, by the way, to stabilize the financial situation. Now some people are raising this issue, again, in terms of the world economy. What does that mean to be a world savior, Robert? Do you think this is an issue of self-inflation or a rise of ultra-nationalist sentiment in China, which might be a modest threat for the image of China for the rest of the world? Robert?
Well, in terms of bond buying, actually the rest of the world, particularly the US and Europe, owe China a big sense of gratitude. There's no way you can get around it. China first did a lot to help America get through the financial crisis that effectively Wall Street created, along with some poor oversight, by buying American bonds and keeping interest rates down. It's done similar things with Europe as Europe tries to sort out its mess. So China undeniably deserves the gratitude of the developed world for that. At the same time, the reckoning that hasn't really occurred is the reason China does that is it wants to keep those markets open and keep those consumers buying Chinese-made goods. So it's been a kind of short-term solution that's ignored a deeper issue. Both sides need to get together to look more at what this implies. I wouldn't call that actually any part of nationalism or a kind of savior mentality or complex on China's part. It was very much welcomed by both the US and Europe. But yeah, it would be better if China could get beyond that, as well as those regions of the world, and think, let's engage in a more constructive financial relationship.
Look, Robert, here is a conflicting view internally here in China as to Tao Guang Yang Hui. You speak perfect Mandarin, Robert. So what's your understanding of the current divided public opinion about whether we should keep a low profile strategically, or we should, as we would soon surpass the US economic size, and size does matter, by the way, there's a growing voice for China to make more contributions accordingly, and that's what Robert Zoellick calls to be a major responsible international stakeholder. Do you think this is the case?
Yeah, I think China actually could benefit quite a lot, and I think it fits with the current President Xi Jinping's vision for the China Dream and things like Belt Road and AIIB and so forth, to in fact have China play more of a leading role and develop soft power. I think the other idea that you expressed goes back to an earlier administration where Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping talked about China keeping a low profile. That made sense in the 90s as China developed itself. Now it's actually, in terms of a macro economy, very rich, and it could indeed help a lot with the world. It doesn't need to overstretch itself. It should be careful about imperialistic overreach that other superpowers have exhibited. But I think it can strike a balance. It's a matter of really looking towards constructive engagement with whether it's the developed world or, more importantly, the developing world. That's where China could play the most constructive and influential role.
Well put. Thank you very much, Robert. I will go back to you in a few minutes. Fabio, a renowned professor from the United States, Paul Kennedy, said many years ago that the imperial overstretch theory in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, Economic Change and Military Conflict from 15,000 to 2,000. He believes that the overstretching of a big country can result in decline of that major power. Do you think this is likely to happen to China?
Okay, Kennedy's book is very famous along with, from my point of view, Arrighi's studies that work on world system theories, analyzing empirically this rise and fall of great powers. 500 years of history of these cycles of rising and falling Western powers. So this is the history of Western powers domination model that started with developing international trade along with military expansion and military aggression to foreign countries. So if China would like to follow this model, China will be in a condition of overstretching in 20, 30 years.
Robert,
Yes.
China is clearly aware of the growing call for China's, or growing appeal for China's international responsibility. However, we are also aware of a sense of humility, which is also one of the virtues of the traditional Chinese culture. Having said this, it's not just a matter of whether China is ready and willing for more of the international expansion or responsibilities. It's that some of the competitors internationally would prevent China from developing too quickly. And they therefore came up with the theory of 修昔底德陷阱, you know, the Thucydides trap. The existing power would definitely have inevitable clashes with the rising power. Do you think you know, it takes two sides, it takes many to clap, to welcome the advent of yet another major power?
That's true, and you are correct to point out that the U.S. mainly, but you could say other Western powers, for lack of a better word, that would also include Japan, need to find an accommodative stance insofar as reasonable and reflects their own national interest. I think, again, it's like we were talking about with the internet. How do you define sovereignty? How do you define, you know, key security matters? I believe, just like your show is named Dialogue, Yang Rui, that type of sense of communication and trying to get to truly win-win outcomes is going to be key here, because we can always argue, well, China's being too aggressive or the U.S. is being too aggressive. It's a matter of establishing common boundaries and understanding the needs of each side, and seeing where both parties or multiple parties can see legitimate interest and work for a common outcome. You know, we have examples like the United Nations. We have examples like whether it's AIIB or the World Bank, although they have their own controversies. Those are all representative of multilateral efforts at development and peaceful coexistence. And I think if we can proceed on that basis, it should be okay.
Here is a very important issue for both sides of the Atlantic Ocean to look at very seriously, Robert and Fabio. It's the issue of soft power. Joseph Nye was the American professor from Kennedy School of Government who first put forward this very important idea as to whether China has the convincing means and ability and let the world believe our rise will not necessarily be a threat. However, they tend, our Western friends tend to examine the implications of China's rise globally through an ideological lens. They say, hey, you are still a communist regime. Communist ideology would still help govern and shape your official lines, whatever they are. And therefore, the issue of mutual distrust takes root, and it takes time. What do you think, Robert?
I think mutual trust does take time. It also takes evidence. So I'm sure China is looking for evidence from the U.S. Regarding, for example, the South China Sea and other areas it considers very contentious, as is the U.S. and its allies. They're looking for proof. But beyond that, if we look at the core of soft power, it's really this notion of ideas. Communism for most of the world is on its way out, but if we talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is something that really China has a unique way of defining, at least that applies for China. It's working for China so far. It's really hard to argue that it isn't working. So to get beyond these ideological rifts, I think if China can keep showing, look, we've got success stories like Alibaba, we're doing things like we see with WeChat and FinTech that is absolutely blowing away the rest of the world in terms of its success. And that's something everyone can relate to, right? Markets, prosperity, better lifestyles. I mean, that's the sort of soft power image. If China can project more of that, plus I'd also make a big pitch for culture. China has a wonderfully appealing culture, everything from food to clothing to its history. And those are the sorts of things that should really be promoting, and see if we can get beyond some of the military conflict hotspots, see if there's a way for both sides to agree there's a means for stepping back and focus on these things that are universally appealing about China, which I think are very much culturally and market related.
Thank you so much for your very encouraging and engaging analysis about the soft power of China, considering our history and the profound traditional culture. Thank you so much for being with us, Robert. The last question,
sure.
And I would repeat the same concern as to whether it is high time to re-examine the soft power of China. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be 100% the same with Western values, institutions, and so on, so forth.
Yes, you have to avoid to be the same, because universal values can be very human being general values, as I was talking about peace as the main goal of humanity. Normal people need peace, and development and balanced relations need peace. So China has to work a lot about its own soft power, investing a lot on media, investing a lot on Chinese narratives, honest narratives, to counterbalance the unilateral point of view of Western powerful presence through BBC, through CNN, through New York Times, through Financial Times. This is to say just that, in spite of the important reputation, the importance of the information about sensitive topics, they are strongly biased. And so China is still too weak in this.
Thank you so much for speaking of the issue of multilateralism, which characterizes somehow the post-Cold War international political and economic order. With the re-emergence of the Chinese market and its economy, perhaps it's high time to re-examine whether the rapid development of China and its quick integration with the rest of the world would help contribute to a reconstruction of the world order instead of replacing it. And that's what President Xi Jinping has stood for on many international occasions. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.